The train station at Dry Creek was little more than a strip of warped boards, a water tower, and a half-faded sign that leaned in the wind. But that evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, it became a stage for something neither the town nor the world was ready to understand. The crowd had gathered for what they called business. Dusty ranchers, drifters, and traders loitered near the platform, their laughter sharp, cruel. Among them stood a woman, young, barefoot, and proud, even with her wrists bound, the townsfolk whispered. Comanche, her name was Clara, though no one bothered to ask. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, streaked with the dust of the trail. Her dress, torn and faded, had once been white, now the color of old bone, despite the jeers and eyes that cut like knives. She stood straight, chin high, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the setting sun to her left. A trader in a sweat-stained hat barked at the crowd, "Got one right here. Strong as a mare, good for cooking, cleaning, or whatever else a man needs done." A few men laughed, one spat. Another offered a coin, and then came the sound, the low, heavy rhythm of hooves. Heads turned as a tall rancher rode in from the edge of town. His horse was a black gelding, its coat slick with dust and sweat from the long ride. The man atop it was broad as a barn door, Boone Carter, a name that made most men take a step back and lower their tone. Boone was known in 3 counties, not just for his size, but for his silence. Since the war, he'd spoken little, laughed less. He'd buried a wife 5 years back and spent the rest of his days working cattle and living with ghosts. He wasn't looking for trouble that night, just a new hand for the spring roundup, or that's what he told himself. But as he swung down from his horse and stepped into the circle of lamplight, his eyes found the woman standing alone at the end of the platform, and something in him shifted. She didn't look away when he met her gaze, didn't flinch when others might have. There was fire there, quiet, steady, untamed. "What's this about?" Boone asked the trader. His voice, deep as distant thunder, captured Comanche. The man sneered. "Got her in a raid up north. She'll fetch a fair price." Boone's jaw worked. He looked from the trader to the woman. She stood silent, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, they told a different story. Not fear, not surrender, defiance. "How much?" Boone asked. The trader smirked. "Depends. You buyin' for work or pleasure?" Boone didn't answer. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a roll of bills, and threw it down hard enough to silence the laughter. "All of it. And she walks free." The trader blinked, startled. "Mister, that ain't—" Boone stepped forward, his height casting a shadow across the platform. "You heard me." Silence fell. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He turned to the woman then, and for the first time, his voice softened. "You're coming with me," he said quietly. No one moved as he cut her bindings and handed her a blanket. She hesitated, then followed him, barefoot through the dust, past the gawking men, past the station where the world had decided her worth. Boone lifted her onto his horse, mounted behind her, and without another word, rode toward the horizon. The last light of the day stretched long over the plains, painting the 2 figures, the giant rancher and the stolen woman, in the glow of something new. Freedom, maybe, or fate. The townsfolk watched them disappear into the sunset, whispering that Boone Carter had lost his mind. But for the first time in years, Boone felt like maybe he'd found it. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a bruised sky, the last light of day fading into violet dusk. The wind carried the scent of rain and dust, the kind that clung to skin and memory. Boone Carter rode steady, his horse's hooves thudding against the dry earth in a slow, rhythmic beat behind him. The woman sat rigid, her small frame pressed against his broad back, her hands clutching the worn leather saddle. She hadn't said a word since the station. Boone didn't expect her to. He wasn't sure what to say himself. The road wound through open plains and sparse mesquite trees, shadows lengthening with every mile. Boone's mind worked in silence, replaying what he'd done. Buying a woman like a man buys a horse. He'd told himself he'd freed her. But freedom was a hard thing to define when she rode behind him with no say in where they were going. "You got a name?" he asked finally. His voice low, careful she didn't answer, her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where the land met the dying light. "Guess we'll start with quiet then," he muttered. Hours passed before they reached his land. The fences rose like ribs from the soil, stretching toward the low hills that sheltered the Harlan Creek Ranch. Boone swung down from his horse and offered her a hand. She hesitated before taking it, her touch light. Quick, gone almost before it began, he led her to the small ranch house, a sturdy, weather-beaten structure with a wide porch and a light flickering faintly in the window inside. The air smelled of coffee and pine smoke. "You can sleep here," he said, nodding toward a cot in the corner of the main room. "I'll take the chair." Still, she said nothing. Her dark eyes swept over the space, the shelves lined with books and tools, the rifle above the door, the simple table by the hearth. Then, slowly, she stepped inside. Boone poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one toward her. "Ain't much, but it's hot." She took it, watching the steam curl from the rim before sipping cautiously. The warmth seemed to ease her stiffness just a little. "You speak any English?" he asked. Softer this time, a pause, then a single word. "Little." Her voice startled him, low, melodic, careful, as if each sound carried weight. Boone nodded. "That's enough." They sat in silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the sighing wind outside. Boone couldn't help but glance at her from time to time, the way the firelight caught in her hair, the quiet strength in her shoulders. She was nothing like the broken, fearful souls he'd seen before. There was pride there still, something untamed. When she finished her drink, she said quietly, "Why you take me?" Boone looked into the fire. "Didn't sit right. Them men selling you off like cattle. You buy," she said simply. He winced at the truth in it. "I did, but only to stop him. You're free now. You can leave come morning if you want." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, a gesture of understanding, or maybe disbelief. She lay down on the cot, facing the wall. Boone leaned back in his chair, hat tipped over his eyes, but sleep didn't come outside. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices haunting and lonely. Boone stared into the embers and wondered what sort of man he was now, a savior, a fool, or something in between. Across the room, Clara whispered softly in Comanche, a prayer or a song. He couldn't tell, but her voice, low and rhythmic, filled the silence with something gentle and aching. Boone listened, eyes half closed, and for the first time in years, the emptiness inside him began to stir, not with peace, not yet, but with the first fragile spark of it. The days settled into rhythm, as sure and steady as the wind across the plains. Morning came with the cry of roosters and the lowing of cattle. Evening fell with the hush of firelight, and stars so sharp they looked close enough to touch. Clara worked without complaint. She cooked, swept, and helped mend gear with silent precision. When Boone fixed fences or saddled horses, she was there, not watching, but learning. She spoke little, but her eyes said enough, alert, cautious, curious. Boone had never known quiet like this before. Most women he'd met filled the air with words, laughter, or scorn. Clara's silence was different. It wasn't cold. It was watchful, deliberate, like she carried the weight of something too sacred to waste on small talk. He tried not to stare when she moved through the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, her dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She was unlike any woman he'd ever seen, not polished or painted, but strong, graceful, and steady. There was a kind of dignity in her every motion. Sometimes, when he caught her humming under her breath, a low, haunting tune in her native tongue, he'd stop what he was doing, pretending to check a rope or adjust his boots, just to listen. The melody wrapped around him like smoke still. The distance between them was a canyon neither knew how to cross one evening. Boone found her sitting on the porch steps. Watching the horizon turn gold and crimson, he brought her a cup of coffee and sat beside her. "Been here long enough," he said. "You probably noticed, ain't much company out this way." She glanced at him, her face unreadable. "You like alone?" Boone took a sip before answering, "I used to got easier that way, no one to lose." She looked away, her fingers tightening around her cup. Same. It was the first honest thing she'd said to him, a word that bridged something invisible between them before he could speak again. A rider appeared in the distance, kicking up dust. The sheriff from town. Boone's jaw tightened. He rose to his feet, and Clara followed him inside. Instinct telling her trouble was coming. Sheriff Hal Rooker was a small man with a big voice. He tipped his hat when he saw Clara, then looked at Boone with a smirk. "Heard you been harboring an Indian woman." Boone thought I'd come see for myself. Boone's voice stayed even. "She's free, paid for her fare. And I ain't got cause to turn her out." "Free?" The sheriff chuckled. "You know how that sounds, don't you? Folks in town are talking ain't good for a man's name. Keeping one of her kind under his roof." Boone stepped closer, his shadow falling over the smaller man. "My name's my own concern." The sheriff's smile faded. He adjusted his hat, spat on the porch, and said, "Just makin' sure you know what folks are sayin'." Then he mounted his horse and rode off, dust swirling behind him. When Boone turned back, Clara stood by the doorway, her expression tight. "They think bad," she said quietly. "Let 'em," he replied. "You care what town say?" Boone shook his head. "Not a damn bit." For a moment, they stood in silence, the wind tugging at her hair. Then she said, "In my people, a man's honor is what others see." Boone's gaze softened. "And in mine, it's what he does when no one's watching." Something in that made her smile, the first true smile he'd seen from her. Small, hesitant, but real. That night, when the house went quiet and the fire burned low, Boone found himself thinking of that smile long after he should have been asleep and in her small cot by the wall. Clara lay awake too, the words "let him talk" echoing in her mind. Maybe, she thought, this man wasn't like the others. Maybe, in this strange and lonely place, two broken worlds could learn to live under the same sky. 3 days after Sheriff Rooker's visit, the peace on Harlan Creek Ranch began to crack like dry timber before a storm. Boone felt it first, a shift in the air, the way men stopped waving from wagons when he rode into town. The blacksmith, usually chatty, kept his head down. The storekeeper's wife, who'd once fussed over his shirts, wouldn't meet his eye. She'd seen this kind of poison before. It started with a whisper. Then came the looks, and then the trouble out at the ranch. Clara didn't have to be told. She saw it in Boone's jaw, tight as a vice, and in the way he stared off toward the horizon after supper, but she never asked. Instead, she worked harder, baking extra bread, tending the horses, mending the broken latch on the chicken coop. It was her way of fighting the fear by keeping her hands busy. That evening, as the sun sank low and the air cooled, Boone returned from town with a bruise on his cheek and blood on his knuckles. Clara was on the porch, stringing beans. Her eyes widened. "You fight?" Boone dropped his hat on the railing, his chest still heaving. "Didn't start it." "Who?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Couple of ranch hands from the Cattlemen's Union. Sighed a man who keeps company with a Comanche woman ain't fit to call himself Christian." Clara's gaze darkened. "You should not fight them." Boone gave a bitter laugh. "Tell that to them." She stood, her small figure squared against him. "You get hurt, who help you then?" Her words hit him harder than the men had. Boone looked at her, really looked, and saw the fear hiding behind her. Anger. It wasn't just for him. It was the old kind, the kind that came from a life where loss was expected. He softened his tone. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt me." "Clara." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Not you. I worry they hate me." "Boone, they see me. They see enemy. Boone stepped closer, his voice low. "Steady, you ain't the enemy, not here." But that night, as the wind picked up and the coyotes howled, Boone kept the rifle near his chair. Old instincts told him the trouble wasn't done yet. He was right by morning. The first shot came, a warning. The sound cracked through the dawn like thunder, sending the horses into a panic. Boone bolted from the house. Scanning the tree line, 3 riders stood out by the fence, faces half covered by dust and hate. One of them, a stocky man Boone recognized from the saloon, shouted, "We don't want no blood. Carter just sent her out." Boone's voice was cold as steel. "Ain't happening." "Then maybe we burn that place yours down and see if she runs." The second shot tore through the porch rail, splintering wood near Boone's boot. He fired back once, a warning of his own. The riders scattered, cursing, dust rising like smoke behind them. When Boone turned, Clara was standing in the doorway, pale but steady. "They will come again," she said quietly. "I know. You can't fight all of them. Don't have to," he said, loading another shell into the rifle, just enough to make him think twice. She moved closer, her hand brushing his sleeve, tentative but sure. "I stay, I not run." He met her gaze, something raw in his eyes. "Didn't ask you to." The moment hung between them. 2 souls caught in the middle of a war neither started, but both were willing to end together. Outside, the wind carried the scent of gunpowder and rain, a promise of more trouble to come. Boone looked out over his land, then back at Clara, standing barefoot in the doorway with firelight dancing on her skin. If they wanted a fight, he thought, they'd picked the wrong rancher. The next 2 days passed under a heavy, waiting sky. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Boone worked the ranch as usual, but his eyes were always on the horizon. Every sound, the creak of the barn door, the rustle of brush, set his hand near the rifle. The men from town hadn't shown themselves again, but Boone knew their kind. Hate didn't die easy. It waited for dark. Clara could feel it too. She moved through the house like someone preparing for a storm, her quiet resolve masking the tremor in her hands. She'd seen this before. Men with guns, faces full of fear dressed up as anger. Only this time, she wasn't a child hiding behind her mother's skirts. She was done running that evening. The sky turned the color of rust. Boone was on the porch, cleaning his Winchester. When Clara stepped out beside him, she carried a small pouch tied with leather. "What's that?" he asked. "Medicine," she said simply. "For burns. Cuts, maybe bullets." Boone's jaw tightened. "Ain't gonna be any bullets tonight." But both of them knew the lie in that. The first shot came after sunset, then another, closer this time. Boone grabbed the rifle and kicked open the door, shouting, "Side!" Clara din outside. Shadows moved through the grass, torches in their hands, fire flickering against the wind. Boone fired once, dropping a torch to the dirt. "You boys best ride home before you do something you can't take back." A voice answered out of the dark. "You brought shame on this land, Carter. You think we'll let you lay with an Indian woman and call it right?" Boone's voice boomed back, raw and hard. "She's worth 10 of you bastards put together." A bullet whistled past his head. Another shattered the porch lantern. Then fire. One torch landed against the barn wall, catching dry straw in an instant blaze. Boone cursed, running toward it, but Clara was faster. She tore off her shawl, beating at the flames with fearless strokes. Smoke clawed at her throat, heat licking her face. But she didn't stop until Boone pulled her back. "Get inside," he shouted. "No." She coughed. "They burn. I fight." He stared at her. This woman he'd bought, freed, and somehow fallen in love with. And in that moment, he knew there was no protecting her from who she was. She didn't need saving. She needed standing beside. So he did together. They fought the fire until the last of the flames died, their lungs raw, their clothes streaked with soot by then. The riders had vanished, Cowards who'd found their courage didn't last long against real grit. The ranch was safe. But the barn was half blackened. The air smelled of smoke, and Rainboon slumped against the fence. Chest-heaving Clara knelt beside him, wiping soot from his cheek with the edge of her sleeve. "You foolish man," she whispered. "You could have died." He smiled weakly. "You too," her lips quirked. "Then maybe we both fools." The storm broke then, real rain this time, pouring from the heavens. Washing the ash from their skin, Boone took her hand, rough and trembling, and pulled her close. "I ain't never been good with words," he said, voice low, ragged. "But you got a place here." "Clara always will." She looked up, water streaking her face like tears. "Even if town hate me?" "Let 'em," he said simply. "They don't get to decide who I love," for a long moment. Neither spoke. The fire hissed under the rain, the night alive with thunder and forgiveness when Boone leaned down. Their foreheads touched, not a kiss, not yet, but a promise carved out of smoke and rain and second chances, and for the first time in years, Clara felt it. The feeling she thought she'd buried with her past home dawn came slow and silver, the kind of morning that makes even the scars of the land look beautiful. The rain had washed everything clean, the ashes, the fear, the hate that had ridden in the night before Boone stood by the barn. Staring at what was left, half the wall had burned away, leaving blackened boards and the faint smell of smoke, but the horses were safe. The ranch still stood, and Clara was inside, asleep at last. Her dark hair spilling across his old quilt like spilled ink, watched her fight beside him, not with a gun, but with a courage that could break any man's heart. And as he stood there now, boots sunk in the wet earth, Boone Carter realized something simple and hard and true. He didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to live with her when Clara woke. The light was soft on her face. Boone was at the table, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. She sat up, the blanket falling around her shoulders. "You sleep?" she asked. He gave a half smile. "Some. You?" She nodded slowly, eyes drifting to the window. The sun glinted off the wet grass, turning the world gold again. Boone cleared his throat. "Rough like gravel. Town's gonna hear what happened. Sheriff will come by. Maybe others they'll want to talk." "I'm not afraid," she said simply. "I know." He set down his cup. "But I am, for you." Clara walked to him, her bare feet quiet on the wooden floor. "You fight for me." "Boone Carter, but I can fight too my whole life. I fight to stay alive, now I fight to belong." Her words landed soft but heavy, like a prayer. Boone reached out, his hand finding hers. "Then we'll fight together." They were still standing there, hand in hand, when the sound of hooves came up the path. Boone stepped outside, rifle slung across his back, but barrel down. It was Sheriff Rooker, and behind him, two townsmen. Boone recognized one, the blacksmith. Shoulders hunched, hat in hand, the other was the storekeeper. Looking pale and uneasy, the sheriff stopped near the fence, his horse snorting steam. "Heard there was trouble out here," he said gruffly. Boone nodded. "Trouble found me." "Sure enough." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the charred barn. "Men from the Union?" "Looked like it." The sheriff spat. "Fools ain't the first time they've gone too far." Boone studied him. "Surprised? You here to arrest me or them?" Rooker sighed. "Neither word. In town's changing. Folks don't like vigilantes. Even when they think they're righteous. You stood your ground fair. Carter saved your place." He paused, then added, quieter, "And her." From the doorway, Clara stepped out, standing tall beside Boone. The morning light caught the edge of her hair, and for a moment the sheriff just looked at her, not like an outlaw, not like a curiosity, but like a person. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded once. "I am." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Good town'll leave you be. Guess they finally figured there's more important things to fight about than who a man loves." When the riders left, Boone exhaled slow. Clara turned to him, brow furrowed. "They forgive?" He shook his head, smiling faintly. Maybe not yet, but they're learning. She looked out over the wet fields, the sun warming the grass, and whispered, "Then maybe I can learn too." Boone frowned softly. "Learn what?" "To stay," she said. He reached out, touching her cheek with a rough, gentle hand. "Then stay." She leaned into his palm, closing her eyes for a long, quiet moment. There were no words, just the sound of wind in the grass and the soft rhythm of two hearts learning how to beat in the same place. Boone bent his head and kissed her, slow. Sure, the kind of kiss that didn't promise forever, but believed in it, and when they finally pulled apart, the world seemed a little wider. A little kinder. The land still bore its scars, so did they, but now, those scars weren't just marks of what they'd lost. They were proof of what they'd survived together as the sun climbed higher over Harlan Creek. Boone took Claire's hand again and said, "Come on, we got work to do." And she smiled. That quiet, unshakable smile that had once been guarded but now held the light of belonging for the first time. The ranch didn't just feel like his, it felt like home.